Hi, I'm Emily Muehlstein with the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council, and this is a public hearing video designed to explain and gather your comments on Reef Fish Amendment 53, which considers changing the red grouper allocations and annual catch limits. So we're here because the most recent red grouper stock assessment, CDAR 61, resulted in updated catch advice. It actually reduces our current overfishing limit and acceptable biological catch. And it does that because our current catch levels were overly optimistic and a 2018 red tide event negatively impacted the stock. The assessment also converts to the new recreational landings estimates, and those recreational landings are greater than what we previously thought. This impacts allocations and catch limits. So the Council is obligated to act in order to ensure that harvest does not exceed the newly recommended catch limits. So we'll go a little bit deeper into the background here. The current overfishing limit and acceptable biological catch were set using stock assessment CDAR 42, which was completed in 2015. The OFL and ABC that resulted from that assessment were actually set above any observed harvest in management history. It was later found that that was due to an overestimate of recruits, or an overestimation of the number of red grouper that would reach a size in which they were able to be harvested. At the time, fishermen expressed concern about the stock health, and the Council did choose a conservative catch limit. Then we received ongoing stakeholder feedback, and there was another red tide event that prompted us to use updated catch advice to set the annual catch limit equal to the combined commercial and recreational harvest for 2017. Then in 2018, another red tide event occurred, which is assumed to be as severe as the 2005 red tide event. Now this impacts projections from CDAR 61 for future harvest that has to be reduced in order to account for the impact of that event. Next, changes in the recreational data collection program adjust our estimates of recreational harvest back in time. So our current allocations, which are set at 76% commercial and 24% recreational, were set using the Marine Recreational Fisheries Statistics Survey, or MRFS. That's the original recreational data collection program. Our current overfishing limit, acceptable biological catch, and annual catch limits are set using something called the Marine Recreational Information Program's Coastal Household Telephone Survey, or MRIP-CHTS. And then CDAR 61, our newest stock assessment, uses the newest version of the Recreational Data Collection Program, which is called the Marine Recreational Information Program's Fishing Effort Survey, or MRIP-FES. Now, compared to previous programs, this new MRIP-FES show that recreational landings are greater than previously thought. This impacts the overfishing limit, the acceptable biological catch, the annual catch limits, and the allocations. The confusing thing here is that the resulting catch limits that we get out of CDAR 61 appear like they're higher than our current catch limits, but if you convert our current annual catch limit to MRIP-FES currency, it actually exceeds our newly recommended acceptable biological catch level. So for example, if you convert the current recreational annual catch limit of 1 million pounds, which is currently expressed in MRIP-CHTS, into the MRIP-FES currency, it would actually result in FES equivalent recreational annual catch limit of 2,100,000 pounds. So that is more than double. So we're here because we have to revise the red grouper allocations between the commercial and recreational sectors using the best scientific information available, and we have to modify the allowable harvest of red grouper based on results of the most recent stock assessment, CDAR 61. We need to do this because we have to use the best scientific information available to establish Gulf red grouper sector allocations, annual catch limits, and annual catch targets. We also need to ensure that the historical participation by both recreational and commercial sectors is accurately reflected by the sector annual catch limits, and that the recreational annual catch limit is consistent with the data that we are using to monitor recreational harvest and trigger accountability measures. So we're considering two different actions here, and I'm going to explain the actions and their alternatives. As I mentioned, our current catch levels are set using MRIP CHTS. Now, if you look at this table, it'll show you that the equivalent MRIP FES annual catch limit is actually 5,260,000 pounds. Now, this MRIP FES equivalent exceeds any of the newly recommended acceptable biological catch levels, which are actually shown in this next table. So based on CDAR 61, there was an array of sector allocations that were considered, and their corresponding overfishing limits and acceptable biological catch levels that were recommended by the Council Scientific and Statistical Committee. And those are shown here on this table. I suggest if you want to take a closer look, you press pause and take a minute. So as I mentioned, the current MRIP FES equivalent stock annual catch limit is 5,260,000 pounds. Now that exceeds all of our newly recommended acceptable biological catch levels. So the Council has to adjust the red grouper stock annual catch limit. And this image shows that the overfishing limit represents the highest amount of harvest possible. The acceptable biological catch is reduced or set equal to the overfishing limit based on scientific uncertainty. And then the Council can set the annual catch limit equal to or below the acceptable biological catch, but it cannot exceed it. So there are some implications to these changes. Changes to the recreational sector's annual catch limit are predicted to impact the recreational sector's season length. Under all of the possible alternatives, the recreational sector's annual catch limit will be lower than the MRIP FES equivalent of the current one. So it will be a reduction for the recreational sector. Changes to the commercial annual catch limit will impact the amount of allocation that is distributed to each vessel that has red grouper individual fishing quota. Now, under all alternatives, the commercial sector would receive a reduction in annual catch limit, except alternative 2, which will actually be an increase, or alternative 6, which would retain the current annual catch limit. So let's talk about the alternatives here. Alternative 1 is the no action alternative. It would maintain that current 76% commercial, 24% recreational allocation. And this information was derived from that MRFS data set from the years 1986 through 2005. And we would also maintain our current OFL, ABC, and ACLS. Now it's important to notice here that this is not a legally viable alternative because it's not based on the best scientific information available, and it would retain catch levels that are above the catch advice produced by CDAR 61. Now, alternative 2 would maintain the sector allocations of 76% commercial and 24% recreational, but it would revise the overfishing limit and the acceptable biological catch as recommended by the Council Scientific and Statistical Committee based on CDAR 61, and it would set the stock ACL equal to the ABC. Alternative 3, which is the Council's current preferred alternative, would revise the sector allocations based on the MRIP FES data for the years 1986 through 2005. And this would result in a 59.3% commercial allocation and a 40.7% recreational allocation. And it would also revise the OFL and ABC based on CDAR 61 and set the stock ACL equal to the ABC. Alternative 4 would also revise sector allocations based on MRIP FES, but it would use the years 1986 through 2009. This would result in a 60.5% commercial allocation and a 39.5% recreational allocation. It would also revise the OFL and ABC based on CDAR 61 and set the stock ACL equal to the ABC. Alternative 5 would also revise sector allocations based on MRIP FES data, but this would use landings from the years 1986 through 2018. This would result in a 59.7% commercial allocation and a 40.3% recreational allocation. And this would also revise the OFL and ABC as recommended by CDAR 61 and set the stock ACL equal to the ABC. Finally, Alternative 6 would revise sector allocations between recreational and commercial sectors to allow the commercial ACL to remain at its current 3.16 million pounds. Now, the allocations for red grouper would be 68.7% commercial and 31.3% recreational under this alternative. And this alternative would also revise the overfishing limit and acceptable biological catch to retain the current commercial annual catch limit. It would also set the stock ACL equal to the ABC. So this table will show you a comparison of the catch limits under each alternative in pounds gutted weight. I suggest, if you want to take a closer look, you hit pause for a moment. And as I mentioned, under all of these alternatives, the recreational season will be impacted. And so this table will show you changes to the recreational sector annual catch limit in MRIP FES, which are predicted to impact the recreational sector season lengths. And so this is just a comparison of the different alternatives and the resulting season lengths from each alternative. Now we'll move to Action 2, which considers red grouper annual catch targets. So annual catch targets are a catch limit that is set lower than the annual catch limit to account for management uncertainty. Annual catch targets reduce the likelihood that an annual catch limit would be exceeded, and also it will reduce the likelihood that accountability measures are triggered. Currently, there is a 5% commercial buffer and an 8% recreational buffer between the ACL and the ACT. These buffers were established using the Council's ACL-ACT control rule, using a 4-year reference period of recent landings from 2016 through 2019. Now, the recreational sector's ACT serves as a post-season accountability measure, meaning if the annual catch limit is exceeded in a year, then the following year, the recreational sector season and management measures would be set to the ACT. Also, it's important to note that normally the commercial annual catch target buffer for a species that is managed with an IFQ would be set at 0. But in this case, we use a 5% buffer to account for any overage that is caused by gag multi-use provisions to the IFQ program. So we simply have 3 alternatives here. The first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would maintain our current 5% commercial and 8% recreational buffer between the ACL and the ACT. Alternative 2 would apply the Council's ACL-ACT control rule to establish a 0% commercial buffer and a 9% recreational buffer. It's important to notice that the commercial buffer at 0 would mean that the gag multi-use allocation would be 0 and that only gag could be harvested with gag allocation. Then alternative 3, which is the current preferred alternative, would maintain the current buffer between the commercial ACL and ACT at 5%, and it would apply the Council's ACL-ACT control rule to the recreational sector, resulting in a 9% buffer between the recreational annual catch limit and annual catch target. So, with that said, we would like to hear your feedback before taking final action on this amendment. We expect to take final action at our June council meeting and would like to hear your comments. You can submit them either through our online comment form located at this tiny URL, or you can simply email us at golfcouncil@golfcouncil.org. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to send us your thoughts about Red Grouper Amendment 53.